Alrighty, two more sections to go. This is section 23, entitled Best Practices for U.S. Importers Working with Forwarders and NVOCCs. Really what we're talking about in this section are best practices and pointers on how U.S. importers, beneficial cargo owners, can negotiate and work with forwarders and NVOCCs. As an overarching theme, U.S. importers should seek to work with ocean freight forwarders and NVOs that enhance their overall value proposition and make them more competitive in global markets. At the risk of getting up on a soapbox here, historically, many importers, and exporters for that matter, viewed transportation and logistics service providers as a necessary evil and expense that detracted from their profits. And honestly, that's not an unreasonable way to look at things. But a more enlightened way to look at things is that logistics, when properly executed, and relationships with forwarders and NVOs, when properly managed, can be a source of competitive advantage. That is an unequivocal statement. There are so many ways that U.S. importers can work with OTIs, ocean transportation intermediaries, to enhance their own competitiveness. We could go on for hours and hours on the subject. Let's just accept it as an axiomatic truth of global trade. What are some of the examples? Landed cost benefits, number one. Forwarders and NVOs work to make a profit. There's no doubt about that. But when properly managed, there are opportunities for landed cost benefits by working with these entities that a BCO can enjoy. Transportation lead time advantages. In the end, to a great extent, it's the forwarders, carriers, NVOs that are responsible at least for the transportation and customs clearance component of cumulative lead time. When well executed, there's a source of advantage there too. And then customer service enhancements, because importers rely on the information provided to them either directly or online to feed information to their customers. Forwarder relationships can be a great source of customer service advantage. It's for that reason, as we see in our second bullet, that ocean freight forwarders, they should be subject to the same vetting procedures that importers use to work with other vendors. All of the vetting procedures we talked about in our sourcing module can and should be applied to OTIs. As a trade tip, kind of summarizing what we just said, best practices in SRM that we talked about in that module on sourcing can be applied to the importer-freight forwarder relationship. When developing an SRM approach, supplier relationship management approach, to the importer-forwarder relationship, here's some things that BCOs should investigate really when vetting out a forwarder/NVO/OTI. First off, what's the corporate structure of the forwarder that we're looking to work with? Who owns the company? Is it a corporate entity? Is it a publicly traded company? Is it a sole proprietorship? What's its financial stability? The good news about working with large publicly traded 3PLs, third-party logistics companies, is that one can see their financial statements. That's not always the case with private companies. We want to work with solvent organizations. How many years have they been in business? Also a good indication. Another good one, from an operational perspective, is where does the forwarder have U.S. office locations? Are they a one-station operation, a station being an office? Or do they have offices and operations in every major port in the country? Or maybe a dozen of the key ports in the country? We want to know that as an importer. And from a footprint viewpoint, last sub-bullet here, what's the total square footage of their office, and probably more importantly, warehouse operation? In every city, they have their own operations. And this would be especially applicable for an importer who's using destination services like transload. Once again, more on transload in Module 7. Continuing on, what else might we look at when working with forwarders and NVOCCs? Once again, we're not here to say one is better than the other, but the question has to be asked. Where overseas does a forwarder/NVO have its own offices versus agent relationships? Many 3PLs, forwarders, NVOs own their own offices overseas. Many others work with agents. Both scenarios can work. We are not here to favor one over the other. What we are saying is As the BCO, we need to ask this question. What is the footprint of overseas operations? Again, especially for a CFS at origin, a container freight station at origin that we as the BCO might need to make use of. How many employees does the company have? To the extent that we can measure, what operational expertise does the employee base have? And another consideration that sometimes is overlooked, the geographic focus of a given company. Most forwarders, NVOs, 3PLs will proclaim their global expertise on every subject known to mankind. Those Renaissance men and women, honestly, don't exist. Going back to the earliest days of freight forwarding and NVOCC operations, companies specialized in geographic areas. The Trans-Pacific eastbound, Asia to the US, exports from the US East Coast to Europe. Now, that's not to say that companies haven't broadened their expertise and their geographic knowledge. What we are saying is that there are many companies out there that still have that geographic focus, and we need to align that focus with the geographic areas in which we as importers work. A few other things. The level of expertise in trade compliance, following the rules and regulations of the country of origin and the country of destination, which for us is the United States. Where we have things like AMS, we see parenthetically in our first sub-bullet point, which is the automated manifest system filing, and importer security filings. These are trade compliance issues that require specific expertise and technological capabilities, by the way. Another more human component, what's the average years of tenure per employee at a forwarding operation? That's a great indicator of the corporate culture of an organization, meaning that the longer people are around, the greater the likelihood that they're working for a good company. That's a good question to ask. Also, type and level of any outsourcing activities that the forwarder might do, meaning that the whole forwarding industry, the whole 3PL industry, it's called 3PL for a reason. Third-party logistics, lots of outsourcing going on. But we as an importer need to understand when we outsource a service to a third party that they might be outsourcing it to someone else. Fourth party, fifth party logistics. What services does a forwarder provide themselves, and what services do they outsource? We need to ask that too. And from a pure administrative perspective, we'd like to know, last sub-bullet point, that the forwarder we're dealing with is actually a licensed OTI. We need confirmation of the forwarder that they are indeed a licensed ocean forwarder and or NVOCC. As a quick trade tip, although it's not on the page, when one goes to an office of a forwarder or an NVOCC, those licenses are oftentimes proudly displayed openly in the lobby of the office. So, next time as a BCO, you go out and do those things, and you're sitting in the lobby for an appointment with a 3PL, don't sit there staring at your smartphone, check the wall for proper licensing. Some other considerations. The first one being evidence of how the ocean freight forwarder manages its relationships with carriers. Remember, that's what an NVOCC is. They are the middle person between the BCO and the steamship line. We want proof not only that the freight forwarder is a solid organization from a customer service perspective, but that they manage their carriers in a professional and disciplined way. Examples of that might be use of standard operating procedures, knowledge of routing guides, contractual agreements themselves. These are just a few. The point here being, when looking to work with an ocean freight forwarder, we would like to see some proof, non-proprietary proof, of how well they manage their relationships with the carriers. Maybe they will provide, they should at least, the ocean freight forwarder, last sub-bullet, a list of carrier partners. Who do they contract with? What are those dozen carriers that they have contracts with? And along with that, some trade references. Almost finished. We already mentioned the first one. What carriers does the ocean freight forwarder have contracts with? Of course, we as the BCO can't see those contracts with the rates that the NVO pays to the steamship line, but at least proof that a contract exists would be nice. Second sub-bullet, does the ocean freight forwarder operate its own LCL consolidation service? From an LCL perspective, this is pretty important, because if the forwarder doesn't operate their own LCL box, as it's called, they're going to outsource that or turn the cargo over to a third party. We actually saw an example of that in the section on ocean import documentation when we looked at an LCL bill of lading. It was clearly a co-load situation, which is what this is called. That's another good question to ask. Any list of neutral NVOCC partners? This one requires a little bit of explanation because an NVOCC, of course, can contract directly with steamship lines. But depending on the geographic areas under contract, a freight forwarder might be stronger in one trade lane than another. And in the trade lanes where they're not so strong, let's say U.S. to Africa, for example, or U.S. to Latin America, the NVOCC that we are evaluating can work with other NVOCCs, yet another subcontracting example. When that happens, it's referred to as a neutral NVOCC relationship. We want to ask our potential forwarder, do you work with other NVOCCs in areas where you're not so strong? Naturally, last sub-bullet, what are the technological capabilities of the forwarder we're looking at? What operational software do they use? Was it developed in-house or did they buy it off the shelf? What are their track and trace capabilities? And of course, do they use cloud-based systems to provide not only forwarding and NVOCC services, but all these other ancillary services we've talked so much about? Couple of other points to consider, operationally oriented, but of course, the use of standard operating procedures and or routing guides with customers. As a BCO, as an importer, this is really critical for us. We want these forwarders and NVOCCs to demonstrate their expertise in the industry that we work as an importer and the services that we require as an importer. One good way of doing that is to say, show me some non-proprietary SOPs and routing guides that you have with other customers. Show me how you onboard no customers. And show me what key performance indicators you use, Mr. Forwarder, to measure not only your performance, but my performance as a BCO too. It's always a good idea, last sub-bullet here, to talk about or solicit information on industry-specific expertise. Just like forwarders might have a geographic area of expertise, they could also have industry-specific expertise. Some of the best examples being consumer electronics. Definitely wearing apparel and footwear. There are forwarders that made their bones in wearing apparel and footwear and continue to work very successfully in those fields. Another might be heavy industry. Ask the question about industry-specific expertise. You'd be surprised at some of the answers you might get. Last slide in this section. Yet another consideration, cargo security capabilities. Depending on the nature of the merchandise we import, we could be highly susceptible to things like theft or just plain loss or damage to the goods. Always ask a question about cargo security, be it related to physical plant, process measures that are taken, certifications that a forwarder/NVO might have in the area of security. Always worthwhile to ask those questions. And then another one that BCOs oftentimes overlook, but it can be super important, is a forwarder's involvement in any mergers and acquisitions. If there's one defining feature of the 3PL industry in general, which includes forwarders and NVOs and such, is that over the last 25 to 30 years, that industry has been rife with mergers and acquisitions. Companies being bought up, some successfully, many, not so much. We as a BCO don't want to find ourselves in a position where we sign a contract with a forwarder in April, and in May it's announced that that forwarder just got gobbled up by a multinational organization. That could be detrimental to the relationship. Ask the question, has the company made any acquisitions that would take their eye off the operational ball and impact us as a BCO? Was the company recently acquired, or are they a target of an acquisition? Of course, no one's going to answer truthfully to that question, but it's worth asking, and one can make a judgment call from there. All right, we're coming up on the last section of Module 6, entitled The Safety of Life at Sea Convention and Verified Gross Mass. Now that by title alone sounds super exciting. It's referred to as VGM. What it lacks in intellectual stimulation, it makes up for in operational importance. we couldn't complete an ocean module without talking about VGM. So we're going to. Once we finish that, we're going to go into Module 7, which broadens our discussion on ocean import operating models like buyer's consolidation, direct-to-store, and transload. Let's finish here before we do that.